Hello. The following is from my treatise titled On State Power and the Administration of Nations. This is Section 2, the empirical. If you have not heard Section 1, I recommend that you do hear it. Let us begin. In his pamphlet Common Sense, Thomas Paine claims, "Of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived." It is difficult to tell from the context whether he is referring to all monarchs or simply the ones he dislikes. He spends the preceding paragraphs blaming the supposed monarchy for all the failings of the English Constitution. The section following is about the state of American affairs at the time. Regardless, it is the former position that I wish to address with a series of easily verifiable historical facts. Those who favor republics are a curious lot. How easily they forget that it was the Edict of Milan, proclaimed by Constantine I and Licinius in the year 313, that established the principle of religious tolerance in the Western world and perhaps beyond. It was the Edict of Nantes, issued by Henry IV of France, that attempted to end the bloodshed of the wars of religion and bring a semblance of peace between the Huguenots and the Roman Catholics. How easily they forget Leonidas, Octavian, Justinian, and Alexios I Comnenus. How easily they forget Louis XIV and Alexander III of Russia. When Charles VII asked Joan of Arc what he could do to show his appreciation for having him crowned King of France at Reims in 1429, she asked that her hometown of Domremy be exempted from taxes forever. Charles VII granted her request, and that promise was honored for over 3 centuries, up until the French Revolution. Show me the republic that could honor such a promise for the sake of gratitude, not pragmatism, for even 3 years, much less well over 300, and I will show you the mythical version of a unicorn with rainbow-colored hair emanating from its backside. Even the American president, Abraham Lincoln, for all his fine words in defense of the republic, was no more than a timid tyrant king. During his reign, habeas corpus was suspended in any district where he or his military felt it was appropriate. Civilians were tried by military tribunals and incarcerated in military prisons for daring to criticize the war. He played republic. He acted like a demure king, and his nation was all the better for it. How easily the partisans of representative government forget their own as well. How easily they forget that Oliver Cromwell was theirs. How easily they forget that Jean-Paul Marat, Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, Jacques-René Hébert, Camille Desmoulins, Georges Danton, and Maximilien de Robespierre were theirs. How easily they forget that Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev were theirs. How easily they forget that many in the modern age are theirs. Even Bonaparte was theirs until he declared himself Emperor of France in 1804. Perhaps he hoped to dampen anti-revolutionary ire with such a move, or perhaps he was simply seeking a more effective form of government. Regardless, as the wars of the First and Second Coalitions had already concluded by this point, Bonaparte was hated in many parts of Europe. As such, his failure was nearly inevitable already. In fact, while much of the French Civil Code was written prior to 1804, many alterations, additions, or accompanying codes, including the Penal Code of 1810 and the Code of Civil Procedure, were introduced after Bonaparte claimed the crown. Those who favor republics will be quick to tell you how the Code Civil influenced many of the laws of modern nations. Not so quick to tell you what parts were added or updated after the empire was declared. They also won't tell you that it was inspired by Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. How easily they forget that Adolf Hitler was a partisan of volunteer government until he, like Bonaparte before him, found himself despised by many parts of Europe, and so he too moved towards mandatory government. This culminated with him declaring himself the Germanic Führer in June of 1941. Mandatory government might well be an effective tool, but even it is not powerful enough to get out of the holes that Bonaparte and Hitler had dug themselves into prior to 1804 and 1941, respectively. In this we see that even the most effective of the partisans of representative government eventually betray those that empower them. Eventually, they realize their folly, even if only slightly. At any rate, I do not have time to review the history of the whole of the world, so I would like to focus on two periods of history. The first is the transition of the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire in the 1st century BC. This will serve as an example of a large representative government becoming a large mandatory government. The second is the period of the French Revolution in the late 18th century AD. This will serve as an example of a large mandatory government becoming a large representative government. Before I begin, a quick note on the classes of ancient Rome. Roman society was divided into a patrician class and a plebeian class. The patrician class was, in effect, a combination of what we would call the nobility and the upper levels of what we would call the bourgeoisie. When we think of the upper levels of the bourgeoisie today, we think of doctors, lawyers, bankers, artists of great reputation, and the executive management of corporations, among others. While not all of these positions existed among the ancient Roman citizenry, at least not in the way we would know them today, those that did were combined with the upper levels of the military and the senatorial class to form the patrician class. The plebeian class generally consisted of those citizens below these positions. That is not to say that the plebeian class was incapable of attaining wealth or political power, though. In fact, particularly by the period of the late Roman Republic, many plebeian families had acquired substantial wealth and power. Very few offices of the Republic, usually religious ones, were reserved exclusively for the patrician class. Some of the sources that I will use in this section will refer to the entirety or sections of the patrician class as aristocrats, oligarchs, nobles, or something else altogether. This could lend itself to confusion. As such, remember what I have told you here. Let us begin in the mid-2nd century BC with some of those circumstances and events that led to the political situation in the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC. A very important issue in this period was that of land reform. The first move came from Laelius, the close friend of Scipio Aemilianus, who must certainly have been behind the proposal. At some date before or during his consulship in 140 BC, Laelius raised the question of public land. No details, unfortunately, are known about his scheme. It was possibly on the lines later followed by Tiberius Gracchus, and envisaged that the state should reclaim all land held in excess of the legal limit of 500 egera, and distribute this in allotments to the landless. But it may have been less thoroughgoing than the Gracchian plan. For example, it might have dealt only with quite recent seizures of land in excess of the legal amount. In view of the conclusion of the wars in Greece and Africa in 146 BC, and the possible needs of some of the troops, the allotments may have been designed for veterans, as well as the poor of Rome, and Laelius perhaps made the proposal during his praetorship in 145 BC. But when the scheme was mooted, it met with such severe opposition from the Senate and landowners that Laelius dropped it. According to one tradition, he gained the cognomen of Sapiens for this act of political expediency. The problems of that age were further intensified when another group rose to prominence. Between the Senate and the people there grew up a third estate, that of the so-called knights, or equites. They owed their rise partly to the fact that senators, who formed a landed aristocracy, were forbidden by law, the Lex Claudia of 218 BC, to take any part in commerce. A sharp distinction was drawn between land and trade, between the governing and the commercial classes. The equites had originally formed Rome's cavalry, and were enrolled in 18 groups called centuriae, but in the 3rd century the censors had drawn up a supplementary list of those whose property warranted cavalry service at their own expense. Probably in the 2nd century this census was fixed by law. It was these men that were commonly called the equestrian order. This group quickly gained wealth, power, and influence. Rome's conquest of the Mediterranean opened up a wide field for commercial activities for rich equites and smaller negotiatores who went in for money lending, banking, and trading. They helped to supply the armies with equipment and stores, and to convert war booty into more transportable cash. The publicani also received contracts from the censors for the performance of public works and for the collection of certain taxes, and they were allowed to take over the operation of mines in Spain and Macedonia. This came about because the Senate had failed to build up a civil service. As such, this group became powerful indeed. The equites thus received many opportunities for advancing themselves, and this growing body of rich and intelligent men would naturally demand some political influence, though at the same time avoiding political responsibility. Further, some senators began to indulge secretly in business deals, and by Cicero's day, though the political rivalry between senators and equites might remain sharp, the ban imposed on senators by the Lex Claudia was widely disregarded. The result of these things was that the political families of Rome became divided into groups that would frequently engage in disputes. These groups did not develop into political parties in any modern sense of the term, but the first half of the 2nd century had witnessed some fierce electoral tussles between rival coteries. Such struggles may have become slightly less tense by 133 BC, when another division within the nobility soon became observable, that into optimates and populares. These words have often been misunderstood, and difficulties have arisen from thinking of the optimates as a senatorial party, and of the populares as a popular, democratic, or reform party. But in fact, both groups, designated by these political catchwords, were members of the same class. One group, the optimates, gained control of the Senate, and by blocking the wishes of the others, forced the latter to seek tribunician support for their measures in the tribal assembly. These were called the populares, the demagogues by their opponents. The real difference lay not in class, nor even in the programs that they proclaimed, but in the methods that they followed. Many of the populares saw a personal predominance, while in contrast the optimates tried to uphold the oligarchy that they controlled. But if the populares as a group frequently shared a common background and used similar tactics, they often varied in motive. Many wooed the populace as a means rather than as an end, their objective being to break the dominant oligarchy, and by using various slogans they urged the people to assert its freedom against the potentia, dominatio, superbia, or libido of the few. Others, as the Gracchi, were genuine reformers who sought popular support because they had at heart the well-being of the people rather than their own personal position. But whether selfish adventurers or altruistic reformers, the populares in their struggle against the optimate faction dominated the political scene in Rome for many decades to come. The Roman Republic was therefore a state where theoretically the people held the power. This seldom worked out in their favor. In 287 BC, the Lex Hortensia had asserted the sovereign authority of the people and had enacted that their resolutions, plebiscita, should have the force of law, binding on the whole community. But this development towards full democracy was checked, partly through the skill with which the Senate gained the lead, and partly because the people were quite content to leave more and more responsibility to the Senate. They seldom questioned the Senate's control of the chief military commands, of finance, or of foreign policy, and they allowed the Senate to appoint judicial commissions to deal with matters that concerned the safety of the state, and to supply the jury when the first permanent court, Quaestio Perpetua, was established in 149 BC. Further, the people's representatives, the tribunes, were always in the city. They could keep an eye on proceedings in the Senate, and they carried much legislation through the tribal assembly. But most of the measures had already been shaped in the Senate, and the tribunes were in fact becoming an instrument of the senatorial oligarchy. Although a single tribune, by expressing his right of veto, could bring the whole machinery of government to a standstill. The trouble was that the people meeting in their assemblies were becoming less representative of the needs of the Roman people as a whole. They largely reflected the wish of the urban plebs, which was very different in 133 BC from what it had been 100 years earlier. But on important occasions, many small landowners within reach of the city could still come in to vote, and thus a sturdy independent country opinion might continue to make itself felt. At times, therefore, the Senate might have to listen to public opinion, but on the whole, the sovereign people was content with the Senate's leadership. All of this leads us to 133 BC, the time of Tiberius Gracchus, who was serving as one of the tribunes of the Roman people. Early in his tribunate, Tiberius proposed a lex agraria to make land available for distribution in allotments, everyone holding more ager publicus than the legal limit of 500 igera, about 300 acres, must give up the surplus, but should retain the 500 igera and possibly also 250 igera for each son up to a maximum of 1,000 igera, which should become the possessors in perpetuity and should not be subject to rent or vectigo. Probably no further compensation was offered. The fertile ager campanus was not included in the scheme. The land so reclaimed by the state was to be distributed to Roman citizens in small allotments, with perhaps a maximum size of 30 igera. The new holders were not allowed to alienate them, and were to pay a small rent. Though his main proposal was only that the law should be enforced as it was, and though his methods were technically legal, Tiberius soon found his bill stymied. As a short-term scheme, the bill had great advantages. There could be no objection on the legal score to this resumption of land settlement. Tiberius's friend, the jurist Scaevola, would have seen to that. It would alleviate much distress, though if the terms of army recruitment remained unaltered and overseas wars continued, it would scarcely prove a permanent solution to the problem as a whole. The existing occupiers of the public land had cause for both satisfaction and annoyance. Those who occupied a small amount could henceforth enjoy security of tenure, but those who had to surrender many acres had some reason to complain. For years, or even generations, they had regarded the land as their own, putting capital into it, building their homes and family tombs on it, using it as dowries for their daughters, perhaps mortgaging it. The majority of the large landowners, who had most to lose by the proposal, were of course senators, but Tiberius had friends in the Senate, and if he had followed the normal procedure of bringing his bill to the Senate before taking it to the people, there is no justification for believing that it would not have been given a fair hearing. Vested interests would naturally have biased many senators, but others might have been willing to consider the good of the community first. Gracchus, however, decided to follow 100-years-old precedent, that of C. Flaminius, who had carried a land bill without consulting the Senate. He took his measure straight to the popular assembly. His motives are obscure. Perhaps he thought that it might get bogged down in prolonged and futile discussion in the Senate, and so decided that, as he had only 1 year in which to act, shock tactics would be better. But his impatience proved unwise. When with eloquent appeals he brought his bill to the Concilium Plebis, it was unexpectedly vetoed in the interests of the Senate by a fellow tribune, M. Octavius, whom Gracchus may hitherto have considered as a friend. The Senate was unwilling to acquiesce in his blatant disregard of its traditional rights. Tiberius soon got his bill passed, though. Undeterred, Tiberius pressed on. In his annoyance he may have withdrawn the concession that the 500 ugera retained by the possessores should become their private property, and proposed that this should remain ager publicus, though still rent-free. He repeatedly urged Octavius to withdraw his veto. He may have tried to delay the transaction of public business until his bill was passed, even if he did not formally declare a justitium. He was even persuaded to submit the question to the Senate for consideration at last, but this was useless, since his conduct had alienated much of the sympathy that he had enjoyed there. Finally, he summoned the people, and after further vain appeals to Octavius to retract, he took a step of the utmost gravity. He proposed the formal deposition of Octavius from the tribunate. The people voted the deposition, elected another tribune in his place, and carried Tiberius's agrarian bill. The bill was passed, but another hurdle remained, to secure its effective working. For this, a commission independent of the Senate would be desirable. Tiberius accordingly proposed, and the people established, a triumviral agrarian commission with judicial powers to settle disputes. Triumviri agris indicandis adsignandis, members probably being eligible for annual re-election. The men chosen were a family group: Tiberius, his younger brother Gaius, and his father-in-law Appius Claudius Pulcher. The commission soon started work, but they needed money to help the settlers to stock their allotments, and public finance was controlled by the Senate, which refused help and insulted Tiberius by offering him an allowance of about 2 shillings a day for his expenses. At this difficult moment, news arrived that Attalus, king of Pergamum, had died and had made the Roman people his heir. Tiberius thereupon introduced a bill, or threatened to do so, to authorize the use of some of this wealth for his settlers, and said that he would bring the question of settling Attilus's kingdom before the people. This was going too far. Until now, the Senate's control of finance and foreign affairs had been unchallenged, but Tiberius was interfering in both spheres. His action must have destroyed any sympathy that still remained for him in the Senate. His reliance on the people will have increased senatorial fears of his aims. He was reproved by Q. Metellus and denounced by T. Annius, but he had got the funds for his settlers. As you might imagine, this did not end well for Tiberius. In the course of the summer, the tribunician elections for the next year drew near, and Tiberius decided to stand for a second tribunate. His motive may have been to remain in office in order to safeguard the working of his agrarian bill, but his intention must have suggested to his opponents a dangerous personal ambition. Re-election was not illegal, but the last important case belonged to a period 200 years earlier, when the function of the tribunate was very different. As harvest time prevented some country voters from coming to Rome, Tiberius may have broadened his program to appeal to more of the city population. At first, a dispute over which tribune should preside at the elections led to an adjournment. Next day, Tiberius and his supporters gathered on the Capitol, where the assembly met. During a discussion about his eligibility to stand a second time, he gave some signal which perhaps accidentally led to a brawl. The meeting broke up, and the other tribunes fled. In the Senate, which met in the Temple of Fides, P. Mucius Scaevola was asked to save the state and destroy the tyrant, to which he replied that he would neither act illegally nor recognize any illegal act by the people. This was no answer for the Pontifex Maximus P. Scipio Nasica, who resorted to force, leading out those senators who would follow him, and joined on the way by other opponents of Gracchus. He rushed to the assembly, where they clubbed and stoned to death 300 Graccans. Tiberius himself was struck down near the door of the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, close by the statues of the kings. A poignant example of the dangers of a republic. Oligarchy is inevitable, and in fact preferable to rule by the mob. The original function of the tribunes had been to protect the people against patrician domination, but this need had long passed, and they had become useful agents for the nobility, often using their veto to check the popular assemblies. In urging the people to depose Octavius while he was still in office, on the ground perhaps that he was blocking the people's wishes, Tiberius was threatening to turn the tribunes into agents of the people's will, whereas constitutionally legislation could only result when magistrates cooperated with the people. To turn the tribunes into a mouthpiece of the people, and to make their veto capable of being swept aside, would be to give the concilium plebis greater responsibility than it could properly wield. When, in addition, Tiberius sought re-election, the possibility of prolonged tribunates would open the way to demagogy. The result would not be democracy on the Athenian pattern, but mob rule or dictatorship. Tiberius may not have been aware of the latent implications of his actions, but he does seem to have sought sufficient personal leadership in the interests of his land reform scheme to render plausible, if not true, the charge of his opponents that he claimed that interrempto senatu omnia per plebum agi debere. To Rome's great loss, the plebs were not capable of responding adequately to such a call. Instead, the Senate responded with force, and thus set in motion the series of civil wars in which the Republic perished. The brother of Tiberius, Gaius Gracchus, did not fare much better. He turned to the Equites for assistance, and helped to make them more powerful. He set up the system whereby vast corporations bid to collect provincial taxes in return for a percentage of the profits. This system, called tax farming, continued through the life of the Republic. Senators were forbidden membership of these corporations, which were controlled by equites. Helping the publicani, or corporations, of the equites was not all. He also assisted them in other ways. Gaius drove another wedge between these two groups with a law excluding senators from sitting on juries in extortion cases. The equites alone, therefore, judged the conduct of provincial governors. As every ambitious senator wanted to govern a province, the enmity of the equites could be fatal. For the first time in Roman history, the Senate's monopoly of power was broken. The Senate bitterly opposed the idea, which was passed into law by a majority of one tribe. A commentator remarked, "In return for supporting the tribunes, the equites obtained whatever they wanted, and the senators were terrified." Gaius was again elected tribune, this time without even standing for the office. The Senate was not willing to tolerate him, though. To separate the Roman people from Gaius, the Senate endorsed another tribune, Livius Drusus. Drusus was a noble, possibly a great-grandson of the Aemilius Paulus, who died at Cannae. Drusus took all that Gaius had promised the people and offered more. He attacked the enfranchisement of the Italians, pointing out that more for everyone meant less for those who already had it. So, posing as a popular champion, Drusus vetoed Gaius's proposals. This was not enough, though, and bloody conflict would soon return to the streets of Rome. The Roman Senate struck, hoping to maintain their power, after some who supported them were killed. The Senate met in emergency session and interpreted their supporters' death as a presage of impending chaos, though Gaius had in fact acted promptly to suppress further violence. The Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the famous last decree. This decree simply ordered the consuls to ensure that the state come to no harm. Unofficially, it gave a senatorial endorsement to whatever action the consuls took towards that end. As you might expect, this led to more violence. A fight broke out on the Aventine Hill, and this eventually led to the death of Gaius Gracchus. The struggle was short and one-sided. Gaius did not fight with any great enthusiasm, and when all was lost, his supporters persuaded him to flee. They fought a desperate rearguard action for him, ironically enough, on the same Sublician bridge that Horatius once held against the Etruscans. Their sacrifice was in vain. Gaius reached a sacred grove, and there, aided by a trusted servant, he took his own life. Some 250 of his supporters died that day, and more in the purges that followed. These events lead us to the final period of the Roman Republic. The Roman failure to face reform in the 2nd century BC led to a revolt by the oppressed non-Roman peoples of Italy at the start of the 1st century. This revolt led to a conflict known as the Social War. The main fighting of the war took place from approximately 90 BC to 88 BC. This war, too, the Romans won, but only by conceding the principal demand of the Italian rebels, that they be allowed into the state as full citizens. As such, the Italian people also entered the Roman legions at a time when the nature of military service was changing. No longer was the Roman legionary a peasant farmer who completed his term of military service and retired to the family farm. More often, he was a landless man who joined the eagles to make his fortune. So the Roman legions now contained a large number of soldiers who had recently been fighting against Rome, and a similar proportion who had the least investment in the status quo. This period would see the rise of Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix. Sulla set the pattern for the late Republic. Defeated by mob violence in Rome, he led his army against the city and conquered it. For the next 50 years, Rome was torn between the wreckers, who did not care what happened as long as they achieved their personal ends, and those who strove, for altruistic or selfish reasons, to preserve the Republic. The time of Sulla serves as a good example of that most ancient Roman tradition, that of dictatorship. For you see, when Rome was truly threatened, they were more than willing to give up their adorable little game of republic and institute a dictatorship. We will begin with the start of his career in public service. Sulla was elected to the office of quaestor and found service with the rising Novus Homo Marius. In Africa, he secured the capture of the troublesome Jugurtha by inducing the Numidian king's father-in-law to betray him. This incident piqued Marius's jealousy, but Sulla remained with him in the campaign against the Germans in 104 and 103 BC. Towards the end of this time, these two powerful personalities may have begun to clash. Sulla left Marius and took service with Lutatius Catulus instead. Soon after this, Sulla was elected praetor. As pro-praetor, Sulla was assigned the province of Cappadocia in Asia Minor. He was given the task of restoring a young king, Ariobarzanes, to the throne of a neighboring kingdom, and he did this with a minimum of fuss, using mainly levies of native troops raised on the spot. On this eastern trip, Sulla became the first Roman official to encounter the rising power of Parthia, which had grown up from the eastern parts of Alexander the Great's old empire. Sulla soon found himself a consul. In 88 BC, Sulla became consul with Quintus Pompeius, probably with the support of the Metellan clan. His daughter then married the son of his consular colleague. Sulla was to command the army that would go east to fight King Mithridates. All would not work out as intended, though. Then came the turning point of Sulla's life. Marius conspired with the tribune Sulpicius to have Sulla removed from the command of the eastern army and Marius put in his place. Not unnaturally, Sulla as consul resisted this and declared the law unconstitutional. Rufus and Marius responded by using mob tactics to push through their legislation. In scenes of disorder, the son of Pompeius was killed and Sulla was forced to flee for his life, finally taking refuge in the house of Marius, perhaps the one place where the mob would not follow. At this point, Sulla resolved to march on the city of Rome itself. Two praetors, a Brutus and a Servilius, came to reason with Sulla, but were sent back to the city with their robes of office ripped off and their official staves broken. There was nothing now to stop Sulla taking Rome, and he did. He reasoned that he had restored order so that normal political life could carry on, and he was therefore unable to do much when a political opponent, Cinna, was elected consul the following year. He did make Cinna swear an oath that he would not act against Sulla or his interests, but it rapidly became evident that Cinna had no intention of abiding by that oath. In command of his army again, Sulla went east to make war on Mithridates. He would soon be forced to return to Italy by virtue of the political situation there, to make war on the state. His arrival at Brundisium in 83 BC brought several leading nobles over to him at once, including Metellus Pius, Appius Claudius, Licinius Crassus, and Pompey. These last two were to spend their lives in an uneasy alliance, first as Sullan supporters, and later as triumvirs with Julius Caesar. With much of his army still in Asia, Sulla was short of men, but he fought with a mixture of savagery and cunning which inspired his opponent Carbo to say that Sulla was sometimes a lion, sometimes a fox, and he feared the fox more. Sulla's campaign to reach the city of Rome went quickly. Within a year he had fought his way to within sight of Rome. The final battle was outside the Colline gate of the city, against an army composed largely of Samnites, who supported the Marian cause. It was a hard fight, and among the fallen was Appius Claudius. Sulla, commanding the center, was beaten back into his camp. He was grimly contemplating the consequences of defeat when a messenger arrived from Crassus on the right wing. Crassus had routed the enemy and completely mastered his part of the battlefield. This victory would see Sulla made dictator of Rome. The realization that the day was mostly won inspired the Sullans as it discouraged their enemies. The Samnites fled or surrendered, and in a complete reversal of fortune, Sulla found himself the master of Rome. The position was soon made official when the Senate made him dictator, the first in Rome for 120 years. After being named dictator, Sulla moved to purge his enemies. Once this was done, he set about reorganizing the Roman Republic. Once the terror was over, it became clear that Sulla did not intend to set up a tyranny. Instead, he set about putting Rome on a stable footing, as far as this was possible. The numbers of the Senate had been terribly depleted from the usual 300 senators by the recent troubles. Sulla not only chose new senators from the Equites to fill the gaps, but he went ahead with the proposal of Livius Drusus and increased their number to 600, rewarding those who had supported him. This was not the extent of the changes Sulla made. He also created more magistrates, raising the number of quaestors to 20 and praetors to 8. He made tenure of a quaestorship an automatic qualification for membership of the Senate, thus ensuring that its numbers were topped up by 20 new senators per year. Sulla crippled the tribunes by ordering that any legislation they proposed had to be ratified by the Senate. He also placed restrictions on the use of the veto and, as a finishing touch, he decreed that persons who had been tribune were henceforth ineligible for any other office. This meant that the tribunate would no longer launch the careers of the politically ambitious. Sulla also increased the number and scope of the standing courts. Then, believing that further tenure of the dictatorship would create dangerous resentment, in 80 BC he returned Rome to civil administration. He and Metellus Pius were the new consuls. At the end of his second consulship, Sulla stepped down from office and became a private citizen. The period after Sulla takes us to the final decades of the Roman Republic. A figure of great importance during this time was Gnaeus Pompeius. With the fall of Rome to Sulla, Pompey was sent to Sicily as pro-praetor to defeat the Marian general Carbo. Pompey fulfilled this with commendable promptness, capturing Carbo and executing him after a show trial, an act which gained him the name of Butcher Boy. Nevertheless, Pompey was moderate in other ways. He ordered his men to refrain from spoiling the country as they passed through, and to ensure that his orders were obeyed, he had the soldiers' swords sealed in their scabbards. Later in his career, Pompey would stand for consul, despite not having served as a lower-ranked magistrate. He succeeded, and he and Crassus were consuls for 70 BC. The partnership was not a success, however. Pompey tended to be populist, whereas Crassus favored the Senate. The major legislation of their year in office rescinded Sulla's restrictions on the tribunate. After his consular year, Pompey would earn the nickname that he is known by today. During Pompey's consular year, the ceremony of discharging those who had completed their military service was held in the Forum in front of the censors. The censors were amazed and gratified to find that among those awaiting discharge was the consul, in full regalia and with his public horse. When asked how many campaigns he had served, and under which commander, Pompey enumerated his campaigns, adding that he had always served under himself. After this, the nickname Magnus, or the Great, which he had assumed since 81 BC, became his accepted appellation. After another series of successful campaigns, Pompey returned to Rome to continue his political career. An immensely wealthy Pompey returned to Rome in 62 BC to celebrate a third triumph. His first had been for victory in Africa, and the second for victory in Europe. The third, for the conquest of Asia, took several days to pass through the streets of Rome. He disbanded his armies and took his place in the Senate, but he got off to a bad start. One of his first actions on arriving in Italy was to divorce Mucia Tertia for infidelity, a move that further alienated the Metellans, already upset by Pompey's treatment of Metellus Creticus. With Cato and Lucullus firmly in the anti-Pompeian camp, Pompey was facing political defeat. He attempted to use Lucullus's enemy Clodius, and in 58 BC even allowed his supporter Cicero to be exiled at Clodius's instigation. But Clodius was nobody's tool, and he soon turned against Pompey, leaving him worse off than before. This forced Pompey to turn to others for help. In 59 BC, his Asian settlement still unratified and his veterans without land, Pompey needed allies. He found them in Crassus and Caesar. The three men formed what a contemporary called the three-headed monster, known today as the First Triumvirate. Caesar got the consulship he wanted and pushed through the legislation that Pompey needed. The alliance was sealed by Pompey's marriage to Caesar's daughter Julia. This alliance would function relatively smoothly for a number of years. The compact was renewed at Lucca in 55 BC, mainly because Crassus wanted to campaign against the Parthians, and he and Pompey were elected consuls for the year. Pompey took command of Spain for 5 years, but did not go there in person, ruling instead through legates. The dangerous Cato almost became praetor in the same election, but Pompey had the voting called off on a religious pretext. Eventually, though, the triumvirate would cease to be. In 54 BC, Julia died. She and Pompey seem to have genuinely loved each other, creating a bond between Pompey and Caesar. Then, in 53 BC, came the news that Crassus had been killed by the Parthians at Caere, and his army destroyed. In the fevered atmosphere that resulted, it was proposed that Pompey be sole consul for 52 BC. Even Pompey's enemies, such as Cato and the ex-consul Bibulus, agreed. The dissolution of the triumvirate led to many political issues. The question now was what to do with Caesar, who had been winning victories in Gaul, even as his political credit ran out in Rome. By 49 BC, Caesar's options were political oblivion or outright rebellion. He chose the latter, and the first of the great civil wars began. The consul, a Claudius Marcellus, gave command of the Republic's forces to Pompey, who had once boasted, "If I stamp my foot, Italy will rise in my support." In the event, a shortage of manpower forced him to withdraw to Greece without a fight and muster his forces there. Let us now turn our attention to Gaius Iulius, the man who destroyed the Roman Republic. In Gaul, Caesar launched a 10-year campaign of conquest, which he described in his own words in The Gallic War, a priceless description of a Roman army on campaign, written by its commander. Caesar's writings were so pellucid that his notes, allegedly for use by future historians, were impossible to improve upon. Even today, many students begin the study of Latin literature with the book's opening words, Gallia in tres partes divisa est, or Gaul is divided into 3 parts. During his campaign in Gaul, the first triumvirate disintegrated, and Caesar's enemies in the Senate were ready to strike. Caesar tried to negotiate out of the impasse, but in vain. His last hope was to be made consul on his return in 48 BC, and thus have a year to defuse the situation. The Senate would not permit his candidacy, and when the tribune Mark Antony and his colleagues tried to force the Senate to change its mind, the tribunes were driven from Rome. Caesar was down to his last option. Caesar had failed politically, but he could still triumph militarily. His army of veterans, it was claimed, could storm the heavens. In 49 BC, he led this army across the limit of his province, a stream called the Rubicon. From that moment, there was no turning back. He was no longer a rogue politician, but a rebel in arms. Caesar took Italy without much resistance. Pompey was slow to raise his levies and wisely decided that they would not stand against Caesar's seasoned troops. Caesar entered Rome. When a Metellus tried to bar his way to the treasury, Caesar restrained his soldiers and grimly informed the man, "At this moment, it is much easier for me to kill you than to keep you alive." Understandably, Metellus gave way. Pompey was in Greece, and Caesar followed him there, but his campaign did not go smoothly. At one point, his men were forced to eat bread made from grass, so perilous was their supply situation. On another occasion, Pompey missed an opportunity to storm Caesar's camp, prompting Caesar's comment, "This man does not know how to win wars." At the Battle of Pharsalus, in 48 BC, Caesar's soldiers were heavily outnumbered. Despite this, Caesar led them to an overwhelming victory. Towards the end of the battle, he rode back and forth, urging his men not to kill fellow Roman citizens unnecessarily, and extended clemency towards the Senate's leaders. Under Caesar, there would be no purges or proscriptions. Caesar had dealt the final blow to the evil Roman Republic. In 47 BC, Caesar was absolute master of Rome. He held a triumph for his many victories, which included a lightning campaign against Pharnaces II, king of Pontus in Asia, summarized by the now famous words Veni, Vidi, Vici, or I came, I saw, I conquered. On the 15th of March, in 44 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar was assassinated. I know of no better example of the hubris of the partisans of representative government than this one. Quote, "History has been kinder to Caesar than he deserves. Caesar replaced an elected constitutional government, however imperfect, with a military dictatorship." End quote. With 2 words, however imperfect, almost 500 years of crimes uncountable, of the most heinous nature imaginable, are swept under the rug. By kinder than he deserves, what is meant is piled under a mountain of slander so tall that Mount Everest would blush if it were able. Finally, let us move to Caesar's nephew and adopted heir, Octavian. After being a member of the Second Triumvirate and winning the civil war with Mark Antony that resulted from its disintegration, Octavian was the power in Rome. Octavian, who had emerged as the heir of Caesar and the leader of a faction, had successfully led his followers to a victory in a civil war that had eliminated all rivals. His faction could now be identified with the state. Per consensum universorum potitus rerum omnium. In these words, he proclaimed his unchallenged and universal sovereignty, and the moral basis upon which he claimed that it rested. As long as this consensus continued to include the loyal support of the armies, Octavian was secure. But now that peace was established, how was he to act? If, like Sulla, he retired, civil war would flare up once more. If he retained autocratic power, naked and unashamed, he might suffer the fate of Julius Caesar. He was thus faced with a most perplexing problem. In order to prevent the outbreak of internal disorders and to safeguard the empire against barbarian incursions, he must retain a unified military command in his own hands. To allow provincial commanders too much independence in the protection of the frontiers would be to invite a repetition of the use that ambitious republican proconsuls had made of their provincial commands to turn against the central government in Rome. Yet an autocratic military despotism would so outrage a 500-year-old tradition of republican government that it must lead ultimately to an explosion. His immediate power secure, Octavian set about stabilizing the Roman state. Faced by this dilemma, Octavian must seek a compromise. In the event, he produced a solution so successful that it gave the world a large measure of peace and stable government for over 200 years. But he did not sit down and draft an ideal solution on paper and then try to implement it. Rather, he proceeded by a slow process of trial and error, feeling his way forward with patient care. By thus testing and responding to public opinion, he was enabled to create the Principate and establish it on a secure basis. In considering his achievement, it is all too easy to concentrate on the result and to overlook the length of time devoted to it. A process that takes many years may appear as a sudden revolutionary adjustment in the eyes of later ages, but to men who lived through it, year by year, it may seem a far more gradual and natural development. Octavian moved slowly at first, until he moved to a new definition of his position in 27 BC. Octavian was content to hold the consulship every year from 31 BC onwards, while he attempted to ease the transition from war to peace and to restore confidence. While still absent from Rome in 30 BC, he had been granted various honors, prayers, and libations, and he had also been offered tribunicia potestas. He had received tribunician sacrosanctity in 36 BC, but he probably did not accept the offer. If he did, he made little practical use of this power before 23 BC. He was granted the right to create new patrician families, whose numbers had been depleted in the civil wars, and he officially used the praenomen imperator, which he had employed unofficially for some 10 years. At the beginning of 29 BC, all his acta were confirmed by the Senate. Eventually, though, he made substantial changes to the state. By August of 29 BC, Octavian was back in Rome and celebrated his triumph, at which his colleague and the other magistrates followed behind him instead of preceding him in the normal position. He used part of the treasures of Egypt to make lavish distributions of money to the people for various shows and for starting a great building program of public works. Thanks to some financial measures, for example, the overlooking of some debts to the state, confidence was restored and the rate of interest dropped by 2/3. The closing of the temple of Janus, which symbolized the re-establishment of peace, was followed by demobilization on a large scale. Not only were there to be no proscriptions, but Octavian's military backing was to be significantly lessened. He reduced his 60 legions ultimately to 28, which he judged would suffice for purposes of defense. Some 100,000 veterans received gratuities and were settled in colonies, either old or new settlements, in Italy or in the provinces. 28 were founded in Italy, while those abroad included Carthage, Pisidian Antioch, and Berytus in Syria. As the land was bought, the settlement cost hundreds of millions of sesterces. Returning stability and normality were seen when Octavian held his sixth consulship in 28 BC, with his friend Agrippa as colleague, and both consuls for the first time in 20 years remained in Rome throughout the year. They turned their hands to a necessary task, a census of the whole people, neglected since 70 BC, and a revision of the Senate. To have sought the censorship might have given offense to the nobility, and so they received a grant of censoria potestas, or else permission to act qua consuls. This would appear quite natural to any historically minded Romans, who might recall that in the 5th century, before the institution of the censorship, the consuls had exercised these functions. Their lectio, perhaps in 29, before the census of 28 BC, reduced the senators from 1,000 to 800, and Octavian's name was placed at the head of the list as princeps senatus. Further, by edict, he proclaimed an amnesty and annulled any illegal and unjust orders that he had given during the civil wars. In short, by all these means, life was in many ways brought back to normal, and it was time for Octavian to make clearer his own position and intentions. After many years of changes, his position within the Roman state became more clearly defined. In practice, he might have found consuls and tribunes willing to implement his wishes, and many of his major laws were in fact sponsored by consuls, but he needed direct authority. This he obtained when he was given tribunicia potestas, probably for the first time in 23 BC. He made much display of this new power. He numbered the years of his reign by it, and Tacitus described it as summi fastigi vocabulum. It was popular, and it gave him such rights as bringing measures before the people and exercising a veto or intercessio. Together with the jura of coercito and auxilium, he could also summon and consult the Senate. But here, consuls and other magistrates took precedence over tribunes. He was therefore given a special additional right, the ius primae relationis, by which he could bring forward the first motion at any meeting. Though the initiative in granting these honors came from the Senate, all his powers were probably sanctioned by the people, who will have passed a lex de imperio. In this way, his authority was secured once and for all. Thus the authority of Augustus was re-established on two foundations, tribunicia potestas, which gave him civil authority in Rome itself, and proconsular imperium maius, which gave him control of the armies and provinces. Of the two, he discreetly kept the latter in the background. He did not even mention it in his res gestae, while he paraded the former before all men's eyes, and these two powers remained the constitutional basis of the Principate throughout its history. Here I will conclude the part on Rome. Please note, this was not intended as a comprehensive review of Roman history during this period. It is only a general overview meant to give a basic idea of the time period in question. Many important events were passed over. If you wish to know more, Howard Hayes Scullard's work, From the Gracchi to Nero, A History of Rome from 133 BC to 68 AD, has much to recommend it. I will now move to the time of the French Revolution. As this period is much closer to our contemporary time, I will not spend as long in the setup. Let us begin in autumn of 1789. History will record that on the morning of the 6th of October, 1789, the King and Queen of France, after a day of confusion, alarm, dismay, and slaughter, lay down, under the pledged security of public faith, to indulge nature in a few hours of respite and troubled, melancholy repose. From this sleep the queen was first startled by the voice of the sentinel at her door, who cried out to her to save herself by flight, that this was the last proof of fidelity he could give, that they were upon him, and he was dead. Instantly he was cut down. A band of cruel ruffians and assassins, reeking with his blood, rushed into the chambers of the queen, and pierced with 100 strokes of bayonets and poniards the bed from whence this persecuted woman had but just time to fly, almost naked, and through ways unknown to the murderers, had escaped to seek refuge at the feet of a king and husband not secure of his own life for a moment. At this point, the revolution in France had already been underway for a few months. It was from the start a farce, begun under false pretenses by dishonest actors, both foreign and domestic. France, by the perfidy of her leaders, has utterly disgraced the tone of lenient counsel in the cabinets of princes and disarmed it of its most potent topics. She has sanctified the dark, suspicious maxims of tyrannous distrust, and taught kings to tremble at what will hereafter be called the delusive plausibilities of moral politicians. Sovereigns will consider those who advise them to place an unlimited confidence in their people as subverters of their thrones, as traitors who aim at their destruction by leading their easy good nature under specious pretenses to admit combinations of bold and faithless men into a participation of their power. This alone, if there were nothing else, is an irreparable calamity to you and to mankind. Remember that your Parliament of Paris told your king that in calling the states together he had nothing to fear but the prodigal excess of their zeal in providing for the support of the throne. It is right that these men should hide their heads. It is right that they should bear their part in the ruin which their counsel has brought on their sovereign and their country. Such sanguine declarations tend to lull authority asleep, to encourage it rashly to engage in perilous adventures of untried policy, to neglect those provisions, preparations, and precautions which distinguished benevolence from imbecility, and without which no man can answer for the salutary effect of any abstract plan of government or of freedom. For want of these, they have seen the medicine of the state corrupted into its poison. They have seen the French rebel against a mild and lawful monarch with more fury, outrage, and insult than ever any people has been known to rise against the most illegal usurper or the most sanguinary tyrant. Their resistance was made to concession, their revolt was from protection, their blow was aimed at a hand holding out graces, favors, and immunities. A great many lies are given as justification for the French Revolution. The wise see through them with ease. Not one drop of their blood have they shed in the cause of the country they have ruined. They have made no sacrifices to their projects of greater consequence than their shoe buckles, whilst they were imprisoning their king, murdering their fellow citizens, and bathing in tears and plunging in poverty and distress thousands of worthy men and worthy families. Their cruelty has not even been the base result of fear. It has been the effect of their sense of perfect safety, in authorizing treasons, robberies, rapes, assassinations, slaughters, and burnings throughout their harassed land. But the cause of all was plain from the beginning. From the moment of the famous oath in the tennis hall, it had all been a lie. Every foundation of this revolution, all lies, fashioned by those skilled in such lies. Judge, sir, of my surprise, when I found that a very great proportion of the assembly, a majority, I believe, of the members who attended, was composed of practitioners in the law. It was composed not of distinguished magistrates who had given pledges to their country of their science, prudence, and integrity, not of leading advocates, the glory of the bar, not of renowned professors in universities, but for the far greater part, as it must in such a number, of the inferior, unlearned, mechanical, merely instrumental members of the profession. There were distinguished exceptions, but the general composition was of obscure provincial advocates, of stewards of petty local jurisdictions, country attorneys, notaries, and the whole train of the ministers of municipal litigation, the fomenters and conductors of the petty war of village vexation. From the moment I read the list, I saw distinctly and very nearly as it has happened all that was to follow. For all the accusations of tyranny, Louis XVI was still made head of government after the imposition of a constitutional system in France. A strange place to put a supposed tyrant. If the French king, or king of the French, or by whatever name he is known in the new vocabulary of your constitution, has in his own person and that of his queen really deserved these unavowed but unavenged murderous attempts and those frequent indignities more cruel than murder, such a person would ill deserve even that subordinate executory trust which I understand is to be placed in him. Nor is he fit to be called chief in a nation which he has outraged and oppressed. A worse choice for such an office in a new commonwealth than that of a deposed tyrant could not possibly be made. But to degrade and insult a man as the worst of criminals, and afterwards to trust him in your highest concerns as a faithful, honest, and zealous servant, is not consistent with reasoning, nor prudent in policy, nor safe in practice. Those who could make such an appointment must be guilty of a more flagrant breach of trust than any they have yet committed against the people. As this is the only crime in which your leading politicians could have acted inconsistently, I conclude that there is no sort of ground for these horrid insinuations. I think no better of all the other calumnies. Even in the time of the French Revolution, the partisans of representative government were no strangers to hypocrisy. First, the voters in the canton, who compose what they call primary assemblies, are to have a qualification. What? A qualification on the indefeasible rights of men. Yes, but it shall be a very small qualification. Our injustice shall be very little oppressive, only the local valuation of 3 days' labor paid to the public. Why this is not much, I readily admit, for anything but the utter subversion of your equalizing principle. As a qualification, it might as well be let alone, for it answers no one purpose for which qualifications are established, and on your ideas it excludes from a vote the man of all others whose natural equality stands the most in need of protection and defense. I mean the man who has nothing else but his natural equality to guard him. You order him to buy the right, which you before told him nature had given to him gratuitously at his birth, and of which no authority on earth could lawfully deprive him. With regard to the person who cannot come up to your market, a tyrannous aristocracy, as against him, is established at the very outset by you who pretend to be its sworn foe. The hypocrisy most certainly does not stop there. The gradation proceeds. These primary assemblies of the canton elect deputies to the commune, one for every 200 qualified inhabitants. Here is the first medium put between the primary elector and the representative legislator, and here a new turnpike is fixed for taxing the rights of men with a second qualification, for none can be elected into the commune who does not pay the amount of 10 days' labor. Nor have we yet done. There is still to be another gradation. These communes, chosen by the canton, choose to the department, and the deputies of the department choose their deputies to the National Assembly. Here is a third barrier of a senseless qualification. Every deputy to the National Assembly must pay in direct contribution to the value of a mark of silver. Of all these qualifying barriers we must think alike, that they are impotent to secure independence, strong only to destroy the rights of men. This is not all, though. When they come to their third basis, that of contribution, we find that they have more completely lost sight of their rights of men. This last basis rests entirely on property, a principle totally different from the equality of men, and utterly irreconcilable to it, is thereby admitted. But no sooner is this principle admitted than, as usual, it is subverted. And it is not subverted, as we shall see presently, to approximate the inequality of riches to the level of nature. The additional share in the third portion of representation, a portion reserved exclusively for the higher contribution, is made to regard the district only, and not the individuals in it who pay. It is easy to perceive, by the course of their reasonings, how much they were embarrassed by their contradictory ideas of the rights of men and the privileges of riches. The Committee of Constitution do as good as admit that they are wholly irreconcilable. The committee attempted to remedy this. Here, the principle of contribution, as taken between man and man, is reprobated as null and destructive to equality, and as pernicious too, because it leads to the establishment of an aristocracy of the rich. However, it must not be abandoned, and the way of getting rid of the difficulty is to establish the inequality as between department and department, leaving all the individuals in each department upon an exact par. Observe that this parity between individuals had been before destroyed when the qualifications within the departments were settled. Nor does it seem a matter of great importance whether the equality of men be injured by masses or individually. An individual is not of the same importance in a mass represented by a few as in a mass represented by many. It would be too much to tell a man jealous of his equality that the elector has the same franchise who votes for 3 members as he who votes for 10. With you there is little, or rather no, connection between the last representative and the first constituent. The member who goes to the National Assembly is not chosen by the people, nor accountable to them. There are 3 elections before he is chosen. 2 sets of magistracy intervene between him and the primary assembly, so as to render him, as I have said, an ambassador of a state, and not the representative of the people within a state. By this the whole spirit of the election is changed, nor can any corrective which your constitution mongers have devised render him anything else than what he is. The very attempt to do it would inevitably introduce a confusion, if possible, more horrid than the present. There is no way to make a connection between the original constituent and the representative, but by the circuitous means which may lead the candidate to apply in the first instance to the primary electors, in order that by their authoritative instructions, and something more perhaps, these primary electors may force the 2 succeeding bodies of electors to make a choice agreeable to their wishes. But this would plainly subvert the whole scheme. It would be to plunge them back into that tumult and confusion of popular election, which, by their interposed gradation of elections, they mean to avoid, and at length to risk the whole fortune of the state with those who have the least knowledge of it and the least interest in it. This is a perpetual dilemma, into which they are thrown by the vicious, weak, and contradictory principles they have chosen. Unless the people break up and level this gradation, it is plain that they do not at all substantially elect to the assembly. Indeed, they elect as little in appearance as reality. A curious system of term limits was also applied. By the new French Constitution, the best and the wisest representatives go equally with the worst into this limbus patrum. Their bottoms are supposed foul, and they must go into dock to be refitted. Every man who has served in an assembly is ineligible for 2 years after. Just as these magistrates begin to learn their trade, like chimney sweepers, they are disqualified for exercising it. Superficial, new, petulant acquisition, and interrupted, dronish, broken, ill recollection is to be the destined character of all your future governors. Your constitution has too much of jealousy to have much of sense in it. You consider the breach of trust in the representative so principally that you do not at all regard the question of his fitness to execute it. As I mentioned previously, England has been a de facto republic since just after 1688. It was inevitable that the virus would spread. The English government, in the initial stages of the Revolution, and for its own short-sighted purposes, was inciting the disturbances in France. Even the signing of a new constitution by Louis XVI in 1791 could not improve matters. By the next year, anarchy reigned again. In August of that year, the Tuileries was stormed by a mob directed by an insurrectionary Paris Commune. The king and his family were seized and taken to the prison of the Temple Tower. The monarchy at last came to its end. The Republic, once so ardently desired by Charlotte Corday and by so many like her, was now at hand. It was not to be officially declared until September 21st, when the National Convention, the new representative assembly, held its first sitting. For directly after the storming of the Tuileries, on August the 10th, and the deposition of the king, the assembly voted to dissolve itself, and called for immediate election of a new body, which was to be called the Convention. Between the downfall of the monarchy and the first meeting of the National Convention occurred the September massacres, that bloody marker at the parting of the ways in the Revolution. One must look to certain powerful ambitions that centered about these elections to discover at least one rational reason for the appalling events that took place in Paris between September the 2nd and September the 8th in 1792. The first day was bloody indeed. The situation did not improve. The bloody work went on for 5 more days and nights. On the morning of the 3rd, the prison of La Force was entered, and here took place the murder of the Princess de Lamballe, the most celebrated victim of the September massacres. The frenzy of the crazed and drunken murderers appears to have reached its highest pitch at La Force. Cannibalism, disembowelment, and acts of indescribable ferocity took place there. The princess, a timid but loyal spirit, had returned to France from the safety of England to be by the side of her friend Marie Antoinette during the troubled days of 1792. She had been arrested in the Temple Tower, where she had accompanied the royal family in its imprisonment, and was returned to La Force, where she met her end a few weeks later. Brought before Maillard's tribunal, she refused to swear her hatred of the king and queen, and was duly handed over to the mob. She was dispatched with a pike thrust. Her still beating heart was ripped from her body and devoured. Her legs and arms were severed from her body and shot through cannon. The horrors that were then perpetrated on her disemboweled torso are indescribable. Traditionally, they have remained cloaked in the obscurity of medical Latin. Because of Madame de Lamballe's rank, her murder is the best known of those that occurred during the September massacres. It has been loosely assumed, therefore, that most of the other victims were like herself, aristocrats, an assumption that for some curious reason is often supposed to mitigate these crimes. This was not the case, though. Very few victims were, in fact, of the former nobility, less than 30 out of the 1,500 who were killed. The massacre that took place at the prison of Bicêtre poignantly testifies to the position of the people during that bloody week. Bicêtre had always been the prison of the people. It is, in fact, ironic that instead of Bicêtre, it had been the Bastille, handsomely furnished and providing an excellent table for its aristocratic prisoners, that had been stormed in July 1789. Had the leaders of the mob wished to free some really unfortunate prisoners, they would have gone to Bicêtre, a sinkhole worthy of the attention of a Piranesi. The depravities of the mob knew no bounds. The mob that descended on it in September 1792, however, was in no mood to liberate any of the 170 unfortunates who were incarcerated there, many of them beggars and the homeless cast-offs of society. All without exception were murdered. Among their number were 33 boys between the ages of 12 and 14. The atrocities committed at Salpêtrière, another prison of the people, were worse. Here, girls of 10 were put to the sword. As you might expect, the revolutionaries were not very good at keeping track of their expenditures either. Each minister had been granted the sum of 100,000 livres for expenses. This sum Danton had accounted for, though carelessly. Certain of the expenditures were peculiar in the extreme. Toussaint, the mob leader of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, had been allocated the sum of 30,000 livres for the making of pikestaffs, an enterprise that could in no way be construed as part of the business of the Minister of Justice. Prudence restrained any objections that may have been felt about that sinister and too suggestive disbursement. This was not the extent of matters, though. For the 100,000 livres allocated to him as Minister of Justice was the least of the sums for which Danton was actually responsible. To the Executive Council as a whole had been granted the additional sum of 500,000 livres for extraordinary expenditures, and of this sum more than half had passed through Danton's hands and vanished without explanation. 3 drafts of 100,000 livres each had been drawn by the Minister of Justice against this deposit. More than that, by wheedling and grabbing, he had taken for himself a good share of the other ministers' portions. His seizure of the funds allocated to Madame Roland's Bureau de l'Esprit Public was typical. Of the use he had made of these enormous sums, he offered no account at all. By December of 1792, madness reigned supreme. In December came news of the trial of the king. This issue was the rock on which the men of the mountain hoped to wreck the Girondins. Their scheme did succeed to the extent of hopelessly dividing their ill-organized opponents. When it became apparent that the mountain was going to petition the convention for a decree ordering the king's immediate execution without trial, the Girondins fought for a trial, thus entering the trap that the mountain had set for them. Certain Girondins then countered with the proposal that the matter be put to the direct vote of all the people of France. Robespierre's sanctimonious argument against this was characteristic. It would be unwise to appeal to the people, he declared, because virtue has always been a minority on this earth. His disciple, Saint Eustace, expressed his doubts more bluntly. An appeal to the people might mean a recall of the monarchy, he said. In January of 1793, Louis XVI was murdered by the criminals that had taken control of France. But from the French people, the king's execution evoked a curiously hollow response. The fanatics, whether monarchist or Jacobin, responded vociferously according to their convictions. The bulk of the people looked on in silence. Louis XVI, the man, had never been unpopular with them. Had he been the tyrant that the extremists accused him of being, there would have been no revolution. He was, in fact, gentle, simple in his tastes, and charitable. Posterity has dismissed him as weak. The evidence indicates the contrary. He stood firmly by his principles. There had been many times when he might have availed himself of Bonaparte's whiff of grape-shot, and by meeting violence with violence have brought an end to the disturbances that rocked his realm. He did not do so, because bloodshed violated the principles by which he lived. I cannot shed the blood of my people. He was to repeat that statement many times, and in many crises, when by the use of force he might have saved his fast-dwindling authority. His successor on the throne was not to be troubled by such scruples. The fault of Louis XVI was his inability to separate himself as a man from himself as a monarch. The monarch, because he failed, might be considered weak. The man was not. Later in 1793, the Revolutionary Tribunal was established. The Revolutionary Tribunal, that agency of blood-stained name which was to become the right arm of the Terror, was established on March the 10th, 1793, shortly after Danton's emergence from seclusion. The death of his wife, and the bitterness that darkened his spirit during his weeks of mourning, undoubtedly contributed to the institution of the tribunal. It was on Danton's proposal that the machine which was to kill him a year later was established. The stage was now set for unimaginable horror. To make the conditions for the reign of terror complete, all that was now needed was a man or a group of men who had control of this machine that dispensed life and death. The Committee of Public Safety was duly instituted 4 weeks after the Revolutionary Tribunal. Its establishment was inevitable. The need for some power greater than that invested in the various executive councils, defense committees, and other such agencies of weak or uncertain authority was made evident by the bad news that reached Paris from the military fronts. The direct outcome of dissension, of inefficiency, and a shameless placing of private political passions over the needs of the young republic. Behind bitter political dispute lay spiteful personal differences. The records of the sittings of the convention at this period are shameful. After the establishment of the Committee of Public Safety, the convention attempted to take steps to prevent it from getting out of control. But the monster was now born. It quickly and skillfully used the powers it had been granted in order to acquire more powers. During Danton's brief dominion, it limited itself more or less to the size in which it had been constituted, but after July, when Danton was replaced on the committee by Robespierre, dictatorial powers were craftily wheedled or extorted from the convention. The rule that membership on the committee had to be reaffirmed every month was soon forgotten, and at so early a date as September, hardly 5 months after the committee's establishment. The sinister motion was proposed to the convention that all who questioned the Committee of Public Safety be considered among the voices of dissent, and thus suspect. Behind such proposals loomed the menacing shape of the Revolutionary Tribunal and the guillotine. The year 1794 was to be no more pleasant than 1793. With the death of Danton, France entered into that dark, brief period of its history that is called the Great Terror, a time that, in the words of Belloc, leaves gaps which many men dare not bridge by reading. The Great Terror was to last for 16 weeks, until the day known in the revolutionary calendar as the 9th of Thermidor, or July the 27th, when, with a desperate convulsion, the convention finally overthrew Robespierre and his cohorts. a very dark time for all who lived through it. It is appropriate to the unreal atmosphere that surrounds this time that the familiar divisions of the year should have been altered, and the months be made to begin on the 21st of the old calendar. These new months were given such fanciful names as Vantos, Prairial, Messidor, and Thermidor. In dating events that occurred during this period, most historians make use of the revolutionary calendar. Thus Danton was guillotined on the 16th of Germinal, or April the 5th, and the terrible law that eliminated all defense before the revolutionary tribunal is known as the Law of 22nd Prairial, or June the 10th. Such terminology is confusing, but it captures a flavor suggestive of the period and of France's temporary alienation from the flow of history. The Reign of Terror certainly earned its name. During the months that preceded Danton's death, the tribunal had claimed 116 victims. In the following 2 months, more than 500 were sent to their deaths. After the law of 22nd Prairial was passed, the carnage began in earnest. Between June the 10th and July the 27th, the day of Robespierre's downfall, 1,366 victims perished. There can be no doubt that if Robespierre had not been overthrown, these numbers would have greatly increased in the months after Thermidor. It was never going to end well. All these considerations leave no doubt on my mind that if this monster of a constitution can continue, France will be wholly governed by the agitators and corporations, by societies in the towns formed of directors of assignats and trustees for the sale of church lands, attorneys, agents, money jobbers, speculators, and adventurers, composing an ignoble oligarchy founded on the destruction of the crown, the church, the nobility, and the people. Here end all the deceitful dreams and visions of the equality and rights of men. Here I will end this part. To go much further will take us to the era of Bonaparte, and that is another matter altogether. Please note, this was intended only as an overview of the history of France in this period, and is by no means comprehensive. This concludes the empirical section. If you wish to know more about this period of history, Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France has much to recommend it. There is a third section, however I will withhold it for now, as certain parts might be considered controversial. I will, however, give you a brief excerpt. It is often said that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. This assumes that the whole of the world is composed exclusively of victims and perpetrators. A poor philosophy, indeed. That will be all for now. Thank you very much for your time. Have a pleasant day.